My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I am your host, Joshua Gibson. And before we get into this incredibly special episode, and I say that because of the person we have on the other side and also the topic we're going to discuss, I did want to mention just briefly a really cool opportunity coming up through Weightlifting House. We are running an event called Coaches Only on March 18th and 19th. We're going to have 7 different speakers, one of them being myself, and we're going to talk programming, business, and long-term athlete development, which is also really, we're really fortunate given that this episode is about long-term athlete development, specifically with maybe high school-aged athletes. We're looking like 13, 14 to 17, 18, and we'll kind of touch on the bookends of that age range as well. But yeah, if you guys want to learn more about Coaches Only, I'm going to put a link in the description. You can go check that out. I think the early bird pricing should still be up. But again, I'll be speaking Dane Miller, Dr. Kyle Pierce, Dr. Kyle Travis, Sarah Minta. The lineup is stacked. So it's going to be a great opportunity. I'd really implore you guys go check that out. Along the lines of long-term athlete development, we have a guy who I think at least in my eyes, is known for his ability to kind of help you understand the process of long-term athlete development, so much so that he made a course for sport parents, kind of explaining the basics of athletic development. And I say it's like for sport parents, but it was actually really high level. And I felt like I was learning a lot and being introduced to concepts like Bondarchuk's exercise classification system. So I think that's an invaluable resource for sport parents, but also sport coaches and people who work with young athletes. Now, with all that being said, the person on the other side, if you haven't already noticed by the title of the show, is Derek Evely. Derek, how are you doing today?
Hey, Joshua, I'm doing great, man. Thanks. It's good to be back on.
Yeah, we've done a few episodes in the past when we talked about exercise classification for weightlifting, as well as kind of like the art of coaching. And I think, from my perspective, you're a guy who really understands coaching. I mean, you also understand training theory like very few people I've ever kind of listened to or talked to. But you have a really good grasp, a really firm grasp on training theory, coaching. I've never actually been able to have the pleasure or honor of seeing you coach and being a part of that, but I imagine you're kind of second to none when it comes to that.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's it's nice of you to say that. You watch me coaching in practice. It's probably way messier than you think, but I appreciate the kind words. Yeah. I mean, I've always had a keen interest in theory and methodology, even way before I met Bondarchuk. And of course, that opportunity was like, you can't get a better opportunity to have one of the greatest minds in sports science move to your hometown and live in your basement and write a book with you. It was quite the opportunity. But I've also, after that, I spent 4 years in what you partially was a coaching think tank in Edmonton, Alberta. You and I talked a little bit about Edmonton before we got online here, where all I did was study coaching, like literally. And that was in the early 2000s. And we were, we kind of, as far as I know, we kind of led the way with online coach development work. In fact, it was so early on that we couldn't actually make it profitable because the world wasn't quite ready for that yet. And then But we produced a lot of interesting material, I think, and we still get a lot of a lot of compliments and accolades on the work that Kevin Tyler and I did there, and Brian Crotman. And yeah, then I started my own website, eviltracksport.com, and thanks for the kind words on the course. And then, that course is kind of interesting because it really was supposed to be 3 courses. And the course that you just went through is, I call it a sport parent course. That was the original plan. And the original vision with it was that there would be 3 courses. And the first one, which is the one that you went through, is really just explaining the ins and outs of physical development to parents so that they could be bulletproof going into a situation where they, where they're starting to put their kids in sport. And I go through all the reasons why that's important these days, and all of that. And it's quite in depth. But there was supposed to be 2 other courses to follow that. One about understanding coaching, and one about understanding your athlete. And those 2, the content in those, I still have all the outlines. I just haven't got down to doing it, but to actually sitting down and recording it. And hopefully I'll get to that someday. But I got busy. I got back into coaching and here in Chicago, and so I've kind of put a lot of that stuff, plus my own podcast, on the back burner. But those last 2 courses were supposed to be sort of what you would think a sport parenting course would be, teaching parents, about attitudes and how to deal with a coach, and both in positive and negative situations, and understanding how to manage your athlete, and what to do if you have a super talented kid and all of that. But that first course was really about nuts and bolts, understanding the physical part of it. And I had Stu McMillan go through that to give me some, feedback on it. And the first thing he said to me, he said, "Look," he said, this is not a course for sport parents. This is a course for coaches." And so I actually went in and changed the title to it to, I added for parents and coaching or something like that. But Altus is I think we are going to work out a deal where I think they're going to take that course over at some point soon, and
Oh, cool.
And it'll be available through them. Yeah, we're probably going to add to it and refine it a bit. It's there's, as you probably found, there's quite a bit in there. It's once I get going, it's hard for me to stop. So.
This podcast is brought to you by Onyx Weightlifting Co. I've been very selective about finding sponsors for the show, but after much deliberation, in conversation with Chris and Danny, the co-owner and founder, we decided that Onyx is beyond a great fit to support this podcast. Onyx is a brand built on providing the strongest and most comfortable straps, wraps, belts, and apparel to the weightlifting community, with the leather products handcrafted by the same barbell calloused hands that you have. Make sure you pick up something today at onyxstraps.com using the code PHILWL for 10% off of your purchase. That is onyxstraps.com, ONYX straps.com, using the code PHILWL for 10% off of your purchase. And thanks as always for supporting the show. Yeah, I mean, you kind of mentioned that, but to me, I found that a huge perk is that there are so many different sections, and they're also built out. And I found it to be incredibly comprehensive. And the reason I reached out to you, and the reason this conversation is happening in the first place, I've mentioned this on a handful of podcasts already, so I don't want to just kind of rehash it. But I'll be starting in, I think I spoke to my advisor, Dr. Hornsby. I'll be starting in June, working with a high school in Morgantown, West Virginia, as the strength and conditioning coach. And I'll basically be taking over, I think there are like roughly 15 teams. So I'll be managing the strength and conditioning training for those teams at the school during the summer, and then into the fall. And then
is this a private school?
No, it's a public school.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
And does your remit include football?
Yeah, it does.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Okay.
basically,
That's interesting.
what Dr. Hornsby has set up is he runs the PhD, and I think and I don't know exactly what he covers, but I know he is going to be my advisor for the coaching and teaching studies program, and he also oversees the masters in strength and conditioning and probably undergraduate degree. But he has three high schools in Morgantown, and what he's been doing for the last I don't know 6-7 years is he's been plugging in graduate students into those high schools. So he has three high schools, and he would generally put a master's student in each high school and have them be the strength coach for 2 years. Um, with
Wow, that's it. Really interesting. So this is more than just a position, a higher position. This is part of an academic uh, endeavor. With that
yeah,
is okay.
yeah, that's
Interesting.
exactly right. So
And is this
basically,
part of some research program, or did
it's
you already mention that? Apologies if you did.
no, I haven't mentioned that, but that's a great point. It's actually a GA position for each student. So they come in, they get their tuition paid for, they get a stipend, and then they work with the high school. Um, I'm the first student coming in who's a doctoral student who will be there for 4 years, and his plan was to um, create some sort of line of research, and then also to start to create a system by which when students come in, there's like a process or a system in place that they can be plugged into, so it's not as kind of like chopped up where student comes in, they kind of do things their I want to say their own way. It's not their own way, but they do things kind of like with their unique bend, and with whatever help from Dr. Hornsby. But once they leave, there's kind of this turnover by which a new system has to kind of be created and get put into place. So with this cohort, it'll be myself, Lauren White, and then Hannah Swarple. We're coming in, and we're going to start to kind of solidify more of a process. And then I'm going to be there for 4 years, and potentially kind of conduct some research on the back end of this. So my my mind immediately goes to I've never really done this before. Like, I've coached weightlifting and powerlifting for what's going on nearly a decade, and I have a good, what I would call like a decent. I don't know how you measure this, but like I have a decent grasp of training theory in practice, and it's kind of like really new to be put in this position. And I was like, okay, who are people I know that have an extensive background, a really strong understanding of this stuff? So I reached out to Spencer Arnold. He just coached three Olympians in Tokyo, and he works at
In what sport? Olympic
in weight
lifting.
yeah, in weightlifting. But weightlifting, what's funny is weightlifting is like his side hustle. He actually works at a high school as the strength and conditioning coach, and he works with 18 teams, and he's there from 6 to 3, and then he
So
does
he must know
weightlifting
Mike.
on the
Mike.
side.
He must know Mike Catone.
Yeah,
He
he
has to.
does. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's
Okay.
really close with Mike. Yeah,
Mike's a
so
great guy.
yeah,
Have
Mike's
you ever
great.
had
So
Mike on the podcast?
I haven't. I have not
Oh
had
my
Mike on
god,
this podcast. I should actually. That's a great idea.
that guy and
Um,
I went out for breakfast once.
yeah,
It was crazy.
yeah,
I mean, it was like we went eyeball to eyeball for like 2.5 hours. Man, I drank so much coffee. It was crazy. That guy he's fantastic. I really like him. Him and I are just really see things pretty much identically. And anyways, I could go on and
well,
on about him. He's really really good.
you know what I'll do?
You should have him on.
I'll do this. I'll set up a podcast with you, myself, and Mike, and then we
That
can
would be great. I would
yeah,
be
we can
right into that. Yeah.
kind of have like
Yeah.
an
Not the
athlete
easiest
development.
guy to pin down,
Yeah.
but he is he's really really good. That when I left that restaurant, I was like, damn, I should have recorded that because it
Yes.
was just him and I geeking out back and forth, and we had this mutual connection, which is an athlete that I coach. But anyways, I got you off topic. Go
No, and
continue what you're saying.
it's funny when you host a podcast, you start to think about conversations in terms of, I really want to record this, or I wish I would have recorded that.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting because I have that thought from time to time where I'll like chat with. I work with Max Zeta, who's one of the best American weightlifting coaches um, in recent history, and or at least in my opinion, and we'll have conversations sometimes, and I'm like, man, that was one for the books. I wish we would have had a mic and just someone would have hit record, but yeah, so basically we're going to create this system and have a process by which we have these high schools under similar structured programs so that it's just not turning over every 2 years, and we're kind of the first cohort to initiate that.
What do you
My
mean not
thought,
turning over every 2 years?
yeah, like when you get a new student in, you kind of get a
Oh,
student
right.
with a new background, with a
Well,
new
what's the point of the research? What's the end goal here with
so my yeah my
for Dr.
very
Hornsby?
Yeah, my very brief understanding of it, because we've just had a few phone calls about, okay, this will be your GA position, this will be your research for your dissertation, uh, and we're still a few months out. But I'm like, I need to get up to speed as quickly as possible. Um, my thought is we're going to have some performance measures or tests along the way, and we're going to track. Okay, let's implement some sort of strength and conditioning. What I would call a system, but it's like I don't know, maybe you call it like an annual plan, or I don't know what
Mhm.
you call it, but basically
A
you have
pathway.
yeah, pathway, and then we have tests along the way to look at how effective or how much that pathway has done what it's supposed to do. Then we're going to have information on, okay, when training athletes this way over this amount of time, these are the changes of the results. And I think what that does is it kind of looks at the efficacy of what, to some extent, it looks at the efficacy of what you're doing, but it also gives you some sort of information that you can show other people. It's like, okay, we
How will you be
use,
able to judge the efficacy of what you're doing?
yeah, that's good, right? Because you would have to pick certain tests that show changes in whatever you're looking at. So if you're looking at, and this is where I think my understanding has been growing, and I'm trying to open up more. Trying to open up. I'm opening up more to this idea of natural maturation that you talk a lot about in the course. Um, and to not get too off topic, you talk about, during these more sensitive periods, you need less specific training because kids are just so sensitive to training. They're highly
Less
trainable.
specialized training.
Less specialized training, right?
Yeah.
So
Big
they come
difference
in,
there. So
yeah.
sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. So they come in, they do less specialized training, they make progress, or they see improvements in what maybe you call it like force production, or I don't know, they become faster, right? These like basic qualities improve. I don't know, basic qualities. These athletic qualities improve. These motor abilities, um, and then that can happen with more general means or less specialized means. Hopefully, I can use those interchangeably, um, or just doing the sport itself, right?
Mhm.
So I've been kind of opening up to that because my background is again in strength sports. It's entirely powerlifting and weightlifting. So when I think
Mhm.
of force production, I think of intensity,
Well,
compound movements, barbells, dumbbells, like
okay.
adding load, right?
Right.
You
So
want to jump in?
yeah. So this is interesting to me. Okay. So here's the thing, and um, not to be, I mean, not to be difficult,
Sure.
but I will be challenging here.
Sure. Yeah.
How, I mean, like, first of all, I predict
Mm,
that you'll be hugely successful. Okay. You'll be hugely successful with whatever measurements you choose in
mm,
terms of and maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying here, but you'll be hugely successful because they will all get better.
right.
Because if you did nothing, they would all get better, right?
Right.
Because they're high school students and they're going to, as long as you don't hurt them, they're going to get better. So not that I mean, those are important things to track and measure, and that's really good. But if you ask me, the real measure of success in a program like that, you don't really find until afterwards, after they
Mm,
leave. So it's after they've left, are they still trainable? What's the injury rate coming out relative to what it was before?
mm,
Okay. What, was there improvement when these athletes moved? out of high school, assuming that the end goal here is for them to, you know, participate in the sport at a higher level, whether that's collegiate or even higher than that. Okay. And now there'll be few of those, but maybe that's a measure. How many of those that you can develop, right? So and I think right there is one of the mistakes that the strength and conditioning community makes when they are working with sports is that they just assume, and I've been quite critical with this. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I talk more to strength and conditioning or performance experts than I do coaches, pretty much. And I think that industry has come a long, long way in the last 20 years. But I think one of the big mistakes they make is they just assume that you know an increase in these performance measures that you can measure to the nth degree these days with
Yeah.
different apparatus in a weight room or whatever just means that the athlete is better. And you mean even at the elite level, that's a that's a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a stretch, a little bit of a stretch. It's not but at the high school level, it's a huge stretch because everybody
Right.
just sort of assumes, well, first of all, I mean, as long, like I said, as long as they're not getting hurt
Yeah.
and they're not being severely overtrained, they're going to improve. But the the measure there is going to be, to me, is yes, absolutely, you want them to improve in everything. You want them to be successful. That's always number one because nobody wants to suck at anything. But then you also have to have, there's two other ones that I think are really important. And I mentioned them. One is, do they stay healthy? And number two is, are they trainable? Like, I mean,
Mm.
if they get out of high school and they go to college and the college coach can't do anything with them because they've been tapped out, then that's kind of useless, right? And Mike and I actually was the big discussion that him and I had at that breakfast was all about all of this and how difficult that is in the American system because it's way different here than it is anywhere else.
Mm.
So, and yes, you have to be that, and that's one of the reasons why I asked you specifically if you're working with football, because
Mm.
football dominates
Yeah.
and there's just no fighting that juggernaut really. And so it's too bad, but it's just the way it is. And so you have to be quite careful with that. And and with athletes when you're working with them here is, the reality is, and I think you'll face this, is you have to for different reasons you have to cut you end up in situations where you have to cut corners and you have to skip steps. You don't want to. In a ideal situation you won't have to, but you know uh, in reality there's very few situations where you don't have to do that.
Yeah. I think this is definitely something that I've found is a consistent message through kind of like, again, the course and also just like all of the content you put out and what you talk about. I've, that all makes sense to me, right? I find that to be a clear and consistent message. So my question on the back end of that would be, if you were to be put in a similar position, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say you're coming in, you're going to be in this program as a student for 4 years, as a a student who's researching this and also doing it for a GA position. What would you want to look at, or what would you look at researching with a 4 years in all these different teams, having this like huge number of high school athletes? What would you be interested in trying to know more about? Maybe it's not trying to know more about, but it would also be conveying to the larger uh, group of people through whatever's published, and then having that kind of exist as like a reference or a resource for people to understand more about long-term athlete development.
That's an interesting question. So I think first of all, I would want to establish. I mean, I would do what you're doing. I would track and monitor as much as I could, as long as it didn't, get in the way of the practicalities of or the day-to-day implementation of your
Mm,
programming, of course, right? So, um, and what I would try to do is I would try to establish correlations or find correlations between different growth in different abilities and success, however you define that, in performance, whether it's whether it's outright performance or it's injury rates or it's,
mm,
like I said, I mean, that's a heavy question, and I would that takes a lot of discussion and a lot of thinking in terms of how you're going to do that. But the only way to really do that is to just start collecting things, and you try to minimize the amount of variation that you're going to have, and try to, obviously, that's what researchers do, right? You try to control as many variables as you can. So that means, for me, that would mean I would try to come up with some kind of 4 year and you know 4 year pathway for each grade, and try to keep it as systematic as I could, and as consistent as I could. But
mm,
again, like I just said, that's I mean, if you're talking about success and getting kids, like, the demographics of this come into play here somewhat. Okay, so for instance, okay, I'll give you. I just spent the last year and a half, year to 2 years, I would say, coaching a number of different athletes, but two in particular that are my main focus. Okay, and this is actually a really interesting story. So I have a girl and a boy, and they're both now seniors. Okay, both come from opposite ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, let's say. Okay, both had equally important and uh, equally important reasons for getting a scholarship.
mm,
Okay, I won't get into the details about that, but one of them was because it would be, for both of them, it was equally life changing. Okay, let's put it that way. Even despite even this disparity of the backgrounds that these two kids come from, one thing I learned right off the bat early on was how important grade 11 is here. Like, I had no clue about that, right?
yeah.
Because at the all performance is based, or all, well, I would say all, but most decisions in terms of scholarship opportunities and things like that, it's all your grade 11 year. Grade 12
Mm,
is nearly meaningless. Okay, aside from a few cases, at least in the sport I coach, right? So offers, they look at your grade 11 performances, and offers start coming out like in the fall of your senior year. Okay, sorry, I always forget to use the terms freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior because I'm Canadian, and we don't use those terms, right? But anyways, but yeah, people understand what I'm talking about. And so, when I, I mean, you don't have, so in that sense, you don't have 4 years, you have three
mm,
years. Okay,
yeah.
and that makes things, you just lost 25% of your pathway right there, if that's your goal, right? And the problem is that, well, it's not a problem, but the reality is that they have goals. These are legitimate reasons to cut corners and skip steps, and this is what I've learned in the U.S. system. So you take Canadian coaches that in the or British coaches, let's say, that coach, and their systems there, especially in Canada, is largely a club system in my sport. Okay, so high school sports is, it's dead compared to what they do down here. Okay,
Mm,
and so an athlete will start training with a coach if they're serious about the sport. They'll start training with a coach. That coach is not within the school system, right? So these coaches have these biases and these attitudes towards the American system and how aggressive it can be and all of this stuff. And that's those are legit, right?
Right.
Because it's like some of the shit you see down here is just, it's incredible. Okay. But the reality is that this is important to a lot of these kids, right? It's very important. And and again, these two kids I coach, one of them, it's like it's his only way, okay, of getting out. Okay, and that sounds dramatic, and it would be overly dramatic if I was talking about any other environment that I've coached in, but not this kid's. This is real. This is real. The female, same thing. Okay, for different reasons, but the same thing.
Right.
And so I found myself in a situation where I'm coaching these two kids, both of who I'm incredibly attached to now, and especially the girl. And she's just a unique person, and I think has she unknowingly, this girl has changed my view on a lot of things, man, a lot of things. And I could make a very strong argument that this girl is never, this girl comes from a background where she's probably never going to have to worry about a lot of things that a lot of us would worry about. Okay. And so, you might look at that and go, okay, well, so who gives a fuck, right? Like, like who, as a, but why I started this coaching endeavor here in Chicago, really thinking I wanted to do something meaningful, quote unquote, and targeting kids that really needed, to make a difference. Let's put it that way. And I coach an event where it's very unique to do that. It's called the Hammer. Well, I coach the throw. I coach everything, but really I focus mainly on the throws and in particular the hammer. Now I can make an argument, a very strong argument, that I can do far more good helping this girl get to where she wants to go, because this girl has the brains, the support, the interpersonal intelligence, which is off the chart, by the way. She could make a real difference in her life by helping her accomplish her goals, which was to get into an Ivy League school.
Wow.
She did that. I mean, now it's like what we're talking about in this this long-term athlete development in your research project. You're not going to see those results with her for another 10 years, because this girl is going to go off. She's good. She got into Harvard. Okay. So we were very successful in that. And the boy got into University of Illinois and is going to be, in this in particular, the boy could go the distance. Like he's that talented. Wow. And he's got a coach that JC Lambert, whose wife is the American record holder and just broke the world record in the weight throw a few days ago as we do this. And so, I had probably the most rewarding freaking year that I've ever had in that sense. And probably the most educational year as a coach. But do you see my point here, right? Like this is, this is real, like to these people, like this is to me and me, of course. But I mean, for me to have an 8-year, long-term athlete development plan like I had when I was in Canada. I had a club structure that was, my strength pathway was an 8-year progression. And, it's just not realistic. Right. So we had to cut corners. And with this girl, the girl in particular, I really had to cut corners because it was, I had less than a year when it came down to it to get her from zero, never touching a hammer, to a level where she could, where she was attracting offers, and she did.
Wow.
It's one of the, to me, I'm not, it's one of the more productive coaching experiences that I've ever had. And man, it was game on. And I'll say this, I mean, I had all the support from the parents. Parents were near perfect in their approach to this, because they did nothing but support
Mm.
and did not get in the way. And it worked, so I had I had the resources to do it. Without those resources, with my experience in what I've done, I not sure I could have done it. Right. Well, I guarantee you I couldn't have done it, because it came down to one thing. When you only have a year and you're trying to develop an athlete in an event that is that technical, it comes down to one thing, and that's repetition. And so when it was obvious early on that this girl was going to be, had the tools, I wasn't sure at the beginning, to be honest with you, really, if she had the physical tools to do it, but we went for it. And the parents said, like, what do you need? And I said, well, we need to be able to throw indoors, like into a tarp, into a net, as often as possible, because we've got less than a year now to get, she's going to need 2,000 throws. And it's as simple as that. If we can do that, we've got a chance. And so, okay, well, let's do it. So we found a place and hung up a tarp, and we did it. And so, and then, that's the same with the strength, right? It was like, yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to go through, a unilateral to contralateral to bilateral progression and all of this. I had to reach down into my bag of tricks and get this girl as strong as I could, as fast as I could. It's one of, and Mike, we didn't really talk a lot about that. Mike was involved with this girl before, before I started coaching her, and through the transition, because she had another coach who did a good job with her in the shot and discus, and then I eventually took over everything. But Mike and I see everything so similarly, that it was really just him and I geeking out on when we were discussing. But I did lean on him for the technique, like in terms of doing Olympics and things like that,
Right.
a little bit, right? And he was really, really good. But anyways, him and I talked about this, yeah. And I remember having that conversation with him at one point. We were talking, and I said, look, dude, you understand, like this is the timeline here. And he went, oh shit. He goes, okay, well, I guess we're going to have to skip some steps. And I said, yeah, we're going to have to skip some steps. We don't have a choice. Right. And so but the point of all that is that, that's, this is a reality a lot of coaches find themselves in. Now, the problem is a lot of them just kind of go, well, fuck it. Just boom, just hit them with everything you can, as hard as you can. But that doesn't, you can't get them hurt,
right?
Because then you've really screwed things up.
Yeah.
When you have that little time and you got to advance that far in that short a time, you cannot afford to lose a week here and a week there. And this girl also, the reality is, she also has a lifestyle that takes her away quite a bit, right? Like the family is able to do a lot of things, they travel a fair amount and things like that. And so, having to deal with that is not the easiest thing, but it's way down on the list compared to, getting hurt. That's for sure. But, so it's not, there's all these complicated factors, right, that come in. With the other kid, it was about, it's like about some of the most basic things. Is there nutrition? Like, did he eat today? Right. So, mostly the answer is no. So, I had to deal with that. Right. And I will say this is the other thing that's really important when you're talking about the US system. Both of these kids, by fluke, had head coaches at their schools and this is something that, sounds like you are not going to run into, because this is all part of a sort of a global effort within with your mentor and the school that you're working in. But very few people are in that situation. Both of these kids had head coaches that were very welcoming for me to come in and work with them in the hammer and the throws, and that's not easy down here. Okay, that's not easy at all. I mean, I had another kid equally as talented at the same time as another boy, and I coached this kid all winter, throwing outside. We were, 3 or 4 days a week. We were icing off circles. I mean, we were like,
Wow.
and it came to school season, where their school season started, and the kid came to me and said, "Yeah, hey coach, my school program. This is in like March, right? This is like a year ago, just about now." And I go, "Oh yeah, okay. Well, how's that going to affect things?" He goes, "Well, I can't come out anymore." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "My coach won't let me." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, the coach won't let me, doesn't want me, he won't let me throw a hammer. He won't, I'm not allowed to attend any other workouts outside of his workouts." And I'm like, "You're kidding me." And of course, this is another one of these things I learn on the fly, right? And he's, "Yeah." And I'm like, "So that's it?" And well, we tried, but no, yeah, that was it. I have almost not worked with that kid since then. Okay. And this kid, Hammer would have, he threw well despite afterwards, but did not advance anywhere near the way this other kid has. And so, because he just stopped throwing the hammer, you can't do that. It's about anything, it's about repetition, right?
Right.
And so, this head coach at this school that this kid is in just basically put a stop to everything instantly. And so again, these other two kids have had these head coaches that were just, they're very rare. Like, I find it's not the norm down here. And so, that's not easy to work within. If the point of that is that if you're not within the high school system here, then it's very difficult. It's all or nothing. Because if you're throwing, like, I was working for this organization called Hammerman USA, where we were taking disadvantaged kids and teaching them the hammer throw, because the hammer is very unique in that it's not taught in high school. It's not really sanctioned for the most part in the US. There's a few states that do, not many. And so if a kid learns the hammer in high school, especially if they do the other throws, they're at a huge advantage relative to a lot of other kids in terms of getting a scholarship, which is what happened with the first two kids I was talking about. And trying to get that across to people it's
Wow.
difficult. And so anyways, I was working for this guy for a year. His name's James Coxworth. Really, really good guy. And he's trying to do kind of what I'm trying to do in downtown Chicago, is, do some meaningful work. I'll bet you this guy's dumped $1 million into this project, and he hired me, and I was working for him, and we had a bunch of these kids from the barrio out in Aurora and outside of Chicago. It was great, and it was all going well. But the problem is you can't get these kids into meets, because they weren't part of their high school teams to throw the hammer. Either the coaches won't let them, or and so these kids can throw. The one in particular is very good. He's been throwing. Jim was coaching him the 3 years before I got a hold of him, and did a very good job with them. And the kid, the kid's doing well. But when you're outside of the system, it's hard to find competitions. And if you can't find competitions, because there are very few of them with the hammer in it, you got to travel. Then you don't get on the rankings. And if you don't get on the rankings, who the hell's gonna know you even exist in terms of getting a scholarship, right? So these are some of the things. It's nice to want to have a law, an actual structured, systematic pathway. But I just babbled and pontificated there about some of the issues, but these are the issues you're going to deal with, right? And so, yeah, so it'll be. I'm interested to see where this thing goes with what you're doing.
Yeah, and I honestly, I'd love to stay connected. And I think what would be great, what I actually did, I mentioned Spencer Arnold. I kind of set up. Hopefully, I can get a podcast in the books with him. But we set up a chat with Lauren Hanna, the other two GAs, and then Dr. Hornsby. So I'd love to make that happen, where we kind of get you on a call with them, discuss it kind of as a group, and then
Mm.
just kind of talk through your experiences and let them kind of like share their thoughts, especially kind of hear Dr. Hornsby riff on, his last 6, 7 years of having coaches in the high schools and kind of what that looks like going forward. I'd love to be a part of that conversation. So
Yeah, he would sounds like he would be fantastic. Like I mean, to pick his brain and talk to him about what he's seen. I'm sure it's quite amazing. Yeah, you can't underestimate the power of the talent pool that is here. Right.
right,
I mean, it's just it is the best thing about American sports, obviously, and it's the worst thing
right,
because you have there's so much talent here, and it makes sense because it's the one nation in the world that is with such a high population. It's and it's multicultural, I guess, is the it's based on an immigrant population, so you have a huge amount of variance there in terms of your genetic pool. You've got you've got weather, which is a huge
right,
a huge advantage. And you have the support in the NCAA system. Plus, you also have the competitive. There's the competitive system, at least in my sport, in the NCAA. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. I mean, love or hate the NCAA system in track and field, which the rest of the world calls athletics, but track and field here is um, love it or hate it. It teaches people to compete,
right.
right? It really does, and that's why the Americans can compete. And so when you're someone like me, running up against all of this, a lot of times and you will, I predict you will run into this if you haven't already, and I'm sure Dr. Hornsby has, is you try to do these things with these well-meaning systematic approaches, and people just look at you and go, well, look, we win everything anyways.
Right, right,
So what's the point? Like what's the point? We're doing well. They're kicking everybody's ass in a lot of sports, right? Like, despite even the fact that, if you're comparing Olympic sport with commercial sport, or they call pro sport, so the talent drain to commercial sport is huge,
mm,
not just from those it's very small actually that go to pro sports, but the talent drain at the college level that takes a lot of this talent away from the Olympic sports, and in a lot of cases destroys it, like just, leaves them no avenue for anything else. So and yet still at Olympic sport they excel, but that doesn't mean everything's being done properly, but it is a system that works to some degree. But when you operate at this level, and now I've gone from developmental coaching to elite coaching, and now I'm back down to developmental, and now I see things from a bit different perspective,
mm.
and so it's they still leave so much on the table. There's so much talent that does not get realized here. It's crazy. Like, it's really something else, especially in a place like Chicago.
So I think this is a good opportunity to uh, kind of transition to the topic of development or developmental coaching, and one way to do that, I think, would be to kind of answer that question that you not question, but that kind of that sentiment that you just gave from a sport coach, which is we're already winning. Like, why does it matter? So uh, my question to you, and maybe you can kind of go into this, is why does a I guess why would an effective kind of like developmental strength and conditioning program have a place? Like, what's the purpose of it, given that you get coaches maybe in schools who don't have their students go to uh, the strength and conditioning sessions or work with the strength coach or see the importance of it or the utility of it. So, what's your argument for a properly designed S&C program within an athlete's development?
Well, it goes back to what I was just saying. I mean, it's they leave a ton of talent on the table, right?
Mm,
And there are, I mean, I've talked to friends of mine. I have friends that work in commercial sport. One in particular, I interviewed him for that sport parent course. His name's Jerry Ramagita. He's one of the top performance therapists in the world. He worked for 15 years for the Seahawks, and now he's working for the Golden State Warriors. He's one of a very, very small pool of people in the world that has both a Super Bowl ring and an NBA championship ring.
wow.
How many people have that, right?
Wow.
And I interviewed Jerry about this, and it's not in the course. It's because I never got around to putting it in, and I got to put it in. It'll be in the Altus version. And I asked him about this. You get all these guys, they're a mess. Like these, these guys get to commercial sport, pro sport. They get there on talent and performance, and then they spend a ton of money trying to keep these guys healthy
Mm,
and being able to perform. And so it's not all it's not all what it appears to be. Okay, so let's let's say that. Okay, there is so much that gets left behind. And number two, I mean, you have an ethical responsibility to do it and do it properly. I think as a
mm,
coach, right? I mean, I don't accept the ignorance argument, right, or excuse, right? There is a way to do it, and that's like I said before. So if yes, you have a lot of restrictions, you have a lot of things that you're going to run up against, but that doesn't mean you throw it all out the window and just give in, right? And so you have to work within the system. Any good coach does that, right? So I think I should also say, okay, that and don't to those of you that are performance professionals or S&C or whatever the term it is you want to use, don't take this the wrong way, but it is never ideal to have a coach, quote unquote, sport coach, farming out this work to an S&C person.
mm,
Okay, it just is not the ideal situation, and we know that because in track and field, which is the one track and field weightlifting. Um, I mean, your background's in weightlifting, right?
right.
Okay, would you farm out the programming to another person? No, right? I mean, there's two parts to Olympic lifting. There's the technique and then
Mm,
there's the loading, right? The
right.
programming, right? Well, why is that any different than in football or hockey or soccer, right? You have the sport and you have why don't these coaches understand this? But they just don't. For whatever reason, they just don't. And so we know in these sports that are um, I don't know, one-offs where maximal single, especially in sports where single maximal efforts are needed, right? Then this marriage of the uh, technical coaching, let's call it, and the loading S&C program, whatever the hell, that becomes critical, okay?
Mm,
Because you're dealing with intensities at a level that a lot of sports don't experience, okay? Even as intense as football can be or hockey or whatever it is, you still don't run into the types of load on the body that um, that you see in track and field or weightlifting or
Mm.
powerlifting or these sports like that. There are exceptions to that, right? Pitching in baseball, right? Especially relief pitchers. That's similar, right? Because those are balls out pitches, especially relievers, right? Um, but for the most part, we, that, and in these, um, in our sports, we can't afford to do it because the margins that we have within to work with are so small that you overload slightly, and the intensities are so high that one error in judgment in that way, and they're hurt, right? Or they're overloaded.
Mm.
You're blowing the nervous system. You're fatiguing. So it's never ideal, right? But again, it's like what we were just spent about 45 minutes talking about.
Yeah.
There's a reality there. There's a reality there, and the reality is that these sports do have S&C people, and like I said, that industry or that profession has come a long way, man.
Hmm.
And so they're not ever going away. That's not going to change. So they got to work, but it's important to understand that, right? So, I kind of went off on a on a rant there, but what was the question?
Yeah, what's the utility of having someone to oversee or supervise and implement
Oh
a
yeah,
strength
yeah.
and
So,
conditioning program?
well, you get it done right,
Right.
right? Like you get it done properly. So you have somebody there that's actually studied, the mechanics of it, right? Look, one of the things, like, if you ask me what advice would I give a young coach if I was starting over again,
Hmm.
and I've learned all this just sort of on my own, but if I was to say, looking back, what advice would I give to a young coach? First and foremost, you got to understand what you're working with. And what
Mm.
that means is, what's the sport that you're that you're preparing an athlete for? It means you got to understand the event or the sport. You got to know the mechanical demands. You got to know the physiological demands.
Mm.
And by that, I mean, the energy systems or neurological demands. You got to know the psychological demands. I mean, you have to know the sport at an intimate level. You got to know the force applications. I mean, you don't have to have a PhD in physics or anything like that, or medical science, but you have to know what those parameters are, because how are you going to prepare an athlete for it? And then once and at the same time, you also have to understand who you're working with. Okay. You got to understand the particular athletes or populations that you're working with. Are they suited for the event? Right. Um, and most importantly, and this goes back to what we've been discussing, what's their potential? Right. Like, if their potential is not Olympic level performance, but is, and say, college level performance, then that's going to impact how you're going to prepare them
Mm.
in high school. Okay. Because yes, it's going to look a little different, um, even in the most progressive situation. It's going to look, those two athletes, the preparation is going to look slightly different, because with athletes that are stupidly gifted, right, you can do less, and
Mm.
they're going to make it through. They're going to have performance. They're going to have a high, if you can get your own ego out of the way as a coach, they're going to have a high performance. They're going to move on. And by not overloading them and not overdoing it in high school, then you've provided a larger envelope for them to excel later on, because we know that it depends on the sport, right? We know that and I go through this in that course that you just took. It's like, you know the natural maturation rates of speed, strength, and endurance are all different. First is
Right.
speed. It's in the early 20s, late teens, even for females, I think it is. um, um, Strength and endurance are later. right? So, that's going to impact how you're going to prepare them. So, the understanding that has a huge impact on the approach that you're going to take. How, you're almost certainly going to have to cut corners and skip steps, but how much are you going to do that? What's that going to look like, right? And then once you understand both those two things, what you're working with and who you're dealing with, then you can start to put together some kind of pathway that makes sense, that has a lot of off ramps for certain athletes that are going to need it. And so at that point, that's where you start learning about how to develop the various abilities. And in particular, speed, strength, and endurance. Too many coaches go right to that before they understand those first 2 points. Okay, and then I guess the other thing I would say there is just to completely just to completely depress anybody who's thinking about getting into this. Don't think in black and white terms. Like, you can't think in disconnected terms. There's no lines in any of this. So again, you can have, you want to have a systematic approach. You want something on paper that's going to describe your philosophy with the populations or the, and the environments that you're working in. Okay. But there's no black and white lines there. Again, it comes back to cutting corners and skipping steps, right? So what does this mean? It means you're going to have to actually think, right? You're going to have to actually think and have the confidence or the balls to be able to put something together that is, that is unique and is going to help the athletes in your situation, in your environment, right? It's like psychology can't be separated from preparation, right? Like, I'm a big believer in that. People that think that, athletes that are good competitors psychologically, yes, some of that comes to them easily, but it's really about preparation, right? If you're prepared, you're going to be good psychologically. It doesn't mean that everybody that's well prepared is good psychologically. Many have to work at it, and that's a skill that you have to, but it's, that's important to understand. And like, movement can't be separated from strength, speed, or endurance. You can't think of those things as different, and yet we break them down constantly, right? It's good to break them down constantly to understand them, but you've got to be able, when you implement it, you have to understand that, right? Like, what's another one? Lifestyle can't be separated from performance, right? You can't think of those things in silos. They're connected. Scheduling can't be separated from recovery, right? And this is the one thing, this one girl I coach, this is one of her big issues, right? Is that, she thinks that, it's like, she doesn't, I'm trying to get, and she's no different than any other high school athlete, but, she thinks that what she does in training is, or what she does in her lifestyle. And I'm not talking about, anything negative. I'm talking about, just being active and being out so much and having all these other activities in her life, has left her little time for rest, right? But and so, she's starting to see that now. We've had a big talk about it, and she's starting to see that, right? It's like the human organism absorbs everything, man. It takes in everything. It adapts to everything, or it maladapts to everything, and that's what you have to understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And I think it's kind of an interesting. It's interesting, this conversation, the way this conversation is kind of unfolded. I think we started with these like very specific two examples of how things would be changed based on the circumstances, and then we kind of broadened to kind of the utility of an S&C or performance coach, and then broadened even more. So I'd like to kind of continue that theme of moving from specific to more general and look at from this like very long term uh, perspective, say you get a kid, I don't know when you feel it's appropriate to start. Well, I guess like kids start in sports at different ages. I don't know when they start in like formal sports or athletics, but what the process from kind of like start to finish would look like, if you could kind of describe that, and what like an ideal execution of that process would look like from a kind of a performance coach or S&C. I think we're using those interchangeably. From that perspective of taking a kid from being interested or getting into sport, which again happens at various ages depending on the skill demands, the flexibility demands, as you mentioned in the course, and then the other three kind of starting later, right? Strength, speed, and endurance. That kind of dictates when the athlete starts more specialized training, and then to the point of being what you would call an elite athlete or high performance athlete. Maybe we can kind of describe, or you can describe that process and what that looks like, and why it's laid out in that way, so it doesn't just seem like um, this arbitrary decision making of like, you have to do more general training because that's just what makes sense, or you have to do more specialized training because that's just what makes sense.
Yeah, are you asking me like in sports in general, or are you asking me in terms of my sport in
I would say
particular?
sports in general,
Right.
and then maybe if you want to kind of nuance it
Well,
toward
that's
your
kind of
sport.
built into the answer,
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. So, well, let's forget about early entry sports for a moment,
Mhm.
okay? Because there are early entry sports. They do start earlier. They are sports that are, um, big. Their demands are technical, like in terms of technique, skill, and flexibility, right? Because those are the two ones that you need to develop early on. Otherwise, you're screwed, right? So let's just park those for a moment. So when we're talking about late entry sports, so which most sports, I think that we are, that's what we pretty much have in mind through most of this discussion that we're talking about here.
Mhm.
So ideally, you want kids to have as wide. Yeah, I don't even really look at it in terms of sports. I look at it in terms of movement experience, right? You want
Mm.
them to have as wide a base of movement experience as they can, as they are maturing, right? So as when they're kids, you want them playing a bunch of different sports, and you want them, and it really is about setting up a strong base of desire for sports. They you want them to enjoy it. You want them to, every day that they come out, you want them not wanting to leave that sport. You want them to really, all of that, all of those good things, and all of that. And you want no formal training for the most part. So formal training is really where you start to take these abilities and you break them down. So when you look at the abilities, skill, flexibility, speed, strength, and endurance, right? So you don't isolate those and start to target them, right? You just let them do the sports. And
Mm.
you know, at first it's play, and then it becomes sports. And then and we could talk about genders, but in reality, that's another one where you just like, yeah, it's important to understand it, but in reality, most coaches, unless they are coaching solely women, they're a women's only coach. If you're a coach in a sport, say at the high school level, and you're coaching both genders, the chances of you having, it's just, I'm not sure how practical it is to be able to create two pathways that are
Mm.
different because of the gender differences. I would, if you can, I would highly recommend it. But if you can't, most don't, right? Most don't even think about it. Everybody gets trained the same way. So let's just say that. So when you get to, you know, there's this whole concept of peak height velocity and all of that, which is really interesting. And I had a big discussion on that on my podcast with James Baker. and Tom Crick, which was a really interesting conversation. And it's one of these things where if you look at the idea of peak height velocity is the speed at which an athlete grows, and you want to wait till that is done before you really start formal training. When you talk to a guy like James and you have a long conversation about it, and you meet it all out the way that we did in my podcast, at the end of the day, you come down to about the age where I was starting my formal training with athletes anyways, which is about the ages of 13 to 15, around 14 years, right? I think he just left Aspire, but Aspire in the Middle East, Tom Crick, one of the more brilliant coaches I know, and one of the more brilliant leaders I know in our sport. He worked with us in the UK when he was younger, and now he's the head coach at Aspire Academy in Qatar. James worked with him, and he's done a very good job out there. But anyways, when you if you're the head coach out there, you have control of everything, and they're not within like this system like they have here in the US. And so you can systematically develop all these things, and you can measure peak height velocity and all that. It's not realistic for most high school coaches here, right? So you're not going to do that. Now that it's not to say you're going to be completely ignorant of it. Where you are going to think about it is where you have a kid there that comes out and they're a late mature, right? And and it's obvious the kid is a late mature for whatever reasons. They got brothers or sisters that came through the program that were monsters, and they haven't had that sprout yet. Well, okay, you're going to back off with that kid, right? If you're smart, right? So anyways, but that aside, you're around, and the other thing with the US system here is they start high school at grade 9, and starting in high school is just a natural, that's where it's a natural change. They're going from one school to another. Things start to ramp up there. In Canada, we start high school at 14 in grade 8. Okay. I think that's a little better actually, because it gives you more time, right? It gives you more time to actually implement something. So one of the, here it starts in grade 9. So at that point, you are going to start what we call formal training. So they're going to go, hopefully before then, they haven't done too much of targeting of these abilities. Now, which is not to say that you should be afraid or you've ruined the kid if they've done a little bit of strength work and things like that. Not at all. They could do a lot of general work, which is, a lot of med ball type work, a lot of jumping. They might even do, some formal barbell or dumbbell stuff, but I would keep that to a minimum. And if you are going to do it, it should be, single support. You don't want any real, you want no overly formal training before that point. And if you're going to err, you're going to err on the side of caution, right? And maybe we can talk about that near the end, because I have some thoughts on that. But so it come high school, if we're talking the US, that's when you're going to start formal training. And so at that point is where you start to break down, or you start to target these individual abilities, and you start to focus on them more. So you start to doing formal speed workouts, formal strength workouts, formal endurance training, depending on the sport and that. But again, these are general comments here, right? Again, you got to go back to what I said at the beginning. You got to understand what sport you're talking about. You got to understand what your population is, right? Like what the athletes are that you're working with. But generally speaking, that's where it happens. But again, here we get back to this thing. I mean, we could talk a lot about formal strength and speed progressions, but in reality, how much time do you have? In reality, again, what's your goal? If it's scholarship, well, you only got 3 years. Okay. So, who are you training? Do they show Olympic potential? And do you even know what that means? Right. Like, are you even aware of what that means? Right. And a big crime a lot of coaches do is they try to, they try to make in our sport it's terrible. I mean, all these coaches working at these lower levels all want to be specialist coaches. So, which means if you're an endurance coach, every athlete that comes across your path, you make into an endurance runner. Or
Right.
if you're a shot put coach, you make them all into a shot putter. And and as opposed to trying to somewhat figure out what they're all going to be good at. But however, you have this competitive system too, and that helps you sort it out as well, because they will gravitate to what they're good at. So anyway, so then from there things get more formal, and you start to target them. Now, one of the big issues there, and again, it's one of these things that which I really tip my hat to your mentor, what's his name, Dr. Hornsby.
Yeah.
Is that having one S&C specialist or a team of specialists in the school that are, and I'm going to make some assumptions here. I'm assuming that all the coaches in these, you said 15 different teams?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so all the coaches in these 15 different teams are all bought into this, right? So they're going to use you, and you guys are going to be able to work together. I'm assuming that. So then I mean, damn, you're already way beyond a lot of other 99.9% of other high school programs out there. So I just took on a new kid, very talented. This kid, he's a junior, so this is a big year for him, right? He's grade 11. And when I took him on, I said to him, and his dad was coaching him. His dad's a good coach, throws coach, but we met at a meet or something, and now I'm sort of taking over a good, for the most part, this kid's training. I said to him at the beginning, I said, look, like, who's doing your strength program? I said, if you want me to coach you only in throws, the technique, okay, then that's not ideal, but I'll do it, or you want me to do it. And him and his dad sort of, they discussed, they said, well, we'd like you to do it. And then after a week or two, this happened last week, actually. He's like, yeah, well, I'm lifting with the football coach in the mornings. I'm like, dude, like, did you can't do that, right? You can't. There can't be two approaches, let alone two loads placed upon an athlete like that. Here I am giving him something, and so I just threw it all out, and I said, okay, so I'm not going to get into that argument, and that I'm not going to fight this, because I know what what the power of the whole football thing in a high school is. So I just said, you just do that lifting, tell me what you're doing, and I'll just work around it, right? But this is a big problem, right? Is you have, let's say you have a multi-sport athlete, a seasonal sport athlete who has, and let's say they do 3 sports, and each one of those sports has a coach, and those coaches want, football wants their strength program. So, and none of these 3 coaches talk to each other, let's say. And so the athlete is doing 3 different programs at times, could be doing, 2 of them simultaneously if the sports overlap, or if any of these 3 coaches want their program to be done year round. And who's monitoring it? Who's overseeing this? Nobody. And there you go. That's a recipe for disaster on many different levels. You're better off to do nothing than you are to do that.
Right.
And so, with this kid, I just said, okay, forget it. I said, I will write. And, what I did is I looked at what he was doing, which has a lot of holes in it. And in particular around core, trunk strength, movement through transverse and frontal planes and all that kind of stuff. And so I designed a program around that. It's just, I'm teaching him one lift, Olympic snatch pulls, and he's got a a ancillary strength routine that is largely targeted towards developing strength through, the midsection and
Mm.
shoulders and things like that. And that's all I'm doing. And, so that's a big deal, right? And so I think it sounds like you guys will not have to deal with that, but
Hmm.
you can't overstate how much of a problem that is.
Right.
You know, I mean, just forget about bad programming. Just think about what about too much programming?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
and here's the thing, right? This is what I wanted to get to. I think I said this earlier. Like, you have to err on the side of caution, right? That's that's rule one in coaching. Okay,
Yeah.
that means two things. It
Mm.
means, number one, you got to keep athletes healthy. Okay, an injured athlete is useless to you. Number two, you got to keep them at the developmental level. You got to keep them trainable. And this
Right.
is one of the reasons why, in some ways, developmental coaching is harder than elite coaching, because you've
Mm.
got this. You want to keep them trainable. If you are really looking at what you're doing, and you really want to look out for the long-term athlete or long-term interests of the athlete, you have to keep them trainable. So, the only times you ever intentionally take a risk with an athlete, or with their health or long-term future, is when there is no future.
Mm.
Okay, so that means, they're at the end of their career, and they're an elite athlete, and they're preparing. Even then, the top coaches that I know at the elite level, they do not allow their athletes to get hurt. They do that they just something, they're always backing off when there is, the little signs of injury start or fatigue start to approach. If that is, signs of fatigue that are not planned for or whatever, right? And you might take, like you might, and so in other words, you might take a risk with an athlete's trainability if they don't have a future as an Olympic athlete, and so then, yeah, you'll take a few risks if you're going to, if the goal is to get them ready at the end of grade 11 to get that scholarship, right? But you should understand what that means, and you should understand how to do that properly, and that's not easy.
Yeah. So I think you kind of mentioned what it looks like when kids either decide to, start it, which a question I had kind of at the start of that kind of explanation of the process was looking at early entry sports and why it is so critical to have the skill component maximized, and then more or less the flexibility component. But why is it critical to target skill very, very early on with early entry sports?
Well, because we know that there's that kids are super adaptable at that age. Okay, so they're like little sponges, so they learn skills easily, and it's quite amazing, actually. Especially, you go on
Mm.
YouTube and you look at some of these things that highly trained kids, in some of these early entry sports can do. It's quite phenomenal, right? And it's not just sports. We know it from music, and we know it
Mm.
from different activities like that. Um, but that's not to say that you can't learn skill later on either, right? I
Right.
mean, that's, Bondarchuk. Bondarchuk didn't start throwing the hammer until he's 25, 24,
Wow.
25. So that, it's not a black and white thing, but I mean, we those sports where skill is, you know uh, where, like gymnastics, right? Well,
Yeah.
and the skill component of it also, or the strength component, is built in with the skill, right? Because all the skill work you're doing is also strength training, and then they
Mm.
do other stuff. They don't know formal weight room work in gymnastics. It's all gymnastics related, right? um but Yeah. So sorry, I missed your. I what was the question again? Yeah, I mean it's pretty simple, right? They learn, so that's why you want to do that at that age, and then and but like I said, that's not black and white thing either, right? I mean, kids, you can improve skills, always improve skills. That's why we do technique work, right? That's why it's, and again, I mean, hammer throwers in this country don't learn, most of them don't learn to throw the hammer till they're in college,
Right.
right? Very few of them learn to throw when they're young, because there's just very few um, competent hammer coaches here. But the ones that do coach at the lower level, they're very competent. There are some really good ones, but there just aren't a lot of them. Not because of incompetency, they just don't know the event, right? I mean, but yeah. So
And then for the late entry sports, it's just that the skill component isn't placed on such a premium, and it's also uh, maybe equally as, and you can maybe explain this, but it's maybe equally as like um, kind of like general ability driven, in that it requires strength and speed or endurance, and those are things that develop along with the maturation of the athlete, so along kind of like that timeline to where they hit late teens, early 20s, and then speed is kind of starting to be more of a target of training, strength is starting to be more of a target of training, and endurance, obviously depending on the event or the sport. But the late entry sports just have a little less of a reliance on skill and flexibility, and more of a reliance maybe on the qualities that are developed within the sport, and then maybe within the weight room, which again is like strength, speed, and endurance. Is that what ultimately differentiates them?
yeah, I don't know if I would say that skill is less important than early entry sports. It's really more. I think late entry sports are really, those are sports that really rely on a an emphasis on certain specialized abilities.
Mm,
Okay, right? So, um, and again, you can't separate the skill from speed, strength, and endurance, or
right.
which or the combination of those. It's not, but you will, like in track and field, sprinting is speed work. Okay, but at that age, once they pass that, they get to the point. Let's say they pass peak height velocity or whatever when they begin formal training. You can start to look at what is going to be needed down
Mm,
the road. And this is a big mistake a lot of coaches make, is young coaches, in my sport. And again, my sport, the reason why everybody comes to my sport, athletics, track and field, or weightlifting, to why the other sports come to us, is because our sports deal with maximal intensified efforts,
right.
right? And so we've spent decades and decades studying this and working with it, and so we it's just part and parcel of what we do, and even most of us don't understand it properly, to be
Right.
honest with you. And so um but and sorry, I lost my train of thought there, man. How long have we been talking? We've been going on almost 2 hours now, hour and a half. Anyways, no. But the thing is that these things are all like you. Oh no, I know what I was going to say. So I'm sorry. Apologize. The big mistake a lot of coaches make is when they start to coach athletes at this level, so entry into high school, is they look at these specialized abilities that
Mm,
are needed at the high performance level, whether it's late college or even beyond that, and they just implement them.
mm,
They're like, okay, well, if you're a 400-meter runner, and you're going to need to do high volumes of lactate work, right? Okay, and so then that's what you start doing at that age. And there's a couple issues with that. Number one is that and there's different philosophies on this. Is that the right ability to be targeting at that age, because I mean, a lot of people think that, you know, that the 400 at the highest level, even the 800, is built off speed work, not necessarily, you know, as a base, okay, as a preparation for elite or high level training. The preparation should a lot of people think it should be speed work, not aerobic or lactate work, right? And the problem is it's hard to do both of those at the same time, especially to a high degree, especially with young kids. Okay, so a big problem is that these coaches, they look at these training schemes that they can find online, or that they hear that these coaches are doing, whether it's speed, strength, or endurance, and they just directly apply it to these young kids, right? Whereas what they should be doing, and I think most people who, anybody who has studied this comes to this conclusion, what they should be doing is they should be preparing them for that. Okay, preparing them, coming up with a system that prepares them for that kind of work. And I said there was two issues with it. One is that the athlete is not physically prepared yet to be able to handle those loads. And number two is we know from studying high performance athletes and where they peak traditionally, it's first, sprints is the earliest, then it's throws and endurance or later into the late 20s, early 30s. We know just from looking at athletes, for the most part, the window of development, or the window of high performance training, intensified training. So you're training, you are doing intensive workloads for whatever event that you're in. You got about an 8 to 12 year window. So let's call it 10 years. And then you have exceptions to that. Merlene Ottey is the biggest one, right? I mean, she competed at a high level, Christ, into her 40s, for crying out loud. Wow. She's an outlier. And, she was dropping off a decade before she was 40. But she was able to hang on, and for a long time. But generally, you're looking at 10 years. You don't want to start that envelope at 13, because then they're done at 23, right? Right. And you want that peak to kind of line up with these natural maturation rates. Again, it's nuanced, right? It's earlier for women than it is for men. It's going to be a bit earlier for sprinters than it's going to be for throwers and endurance athletes. So, that's just the way it is. And, so those are the two issues. Can the athlete handle it, physically tolerate that at a young age? And are you compromising their ability to do it later? Well, it goes back to what we talked about. In the second case, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Maybe you want to do that. Maybe you want, because that window's not going to be 10 years. It's going to be 6, because they're not going beyond college. Okay. So, the earlier you specialize them, and the more intensive and specialized workloads that you apply when they're younger, the shorter, typically, we know this because it happens, they burn out. So the shorter that window is. Okay, because they just don't have on average, they don't have the physical tolerance to be able to handle it. And so initially what you start seeing is, they expect, and here, I say this all the time, oh my God, like I've seen this in Canada so many times. The worst thing, I've said this before, about the worst thing sometimes that a kid can do, an athlete can do, is show talent early. Is show talent at a young age, because the moment they do, it's like the gloves come off with everybody around them, parents, coaches, and everybody. It's like, oh my God, this kid is running this time at this age. Oh my God, they're gonna, the assumption is if you start off running fast, 10, 15 years down the road, you're going to break the world record, because it's just, you only get better, right? Well, no. It turns out you don't. If you've crushed the living crap out of them with specialized workloads, then, here's the other thing too, is that a lot of them will be able to tolerate it to some degree for a certain amount of time before they get hurt or before they burn out. but with most of them, it eventually catches up to them. And so by starting those specialized workloads too early, then you are, and in speed, it means, specialized speed endurance runs, or, in endurance, it means, an overload of essentially the same kind of activity, but more lactate driven work, or huge heavy mileage aerobic, working on aerobic, high levels of aerobic power. In strength, it's, the classic is maximal strength loads, and lifting too heavy too early. And not only, even if they survive being able to tolerate that, where does that give the college coach to go later on,
Right.
right? So, it's this is it's a layered, nuanced discussion. Unfortunately, like all things that are important, that's kind of the way it works. So,
No, that was perfect, and honestly, that helped me connect a lot of dots in terms of, sensitivity to training, or trainability, maturation rates, specialized training. You're trying to essentially create this like ramp, or yeah, you call it like a pathway of getting to a point where you can take advantage of highly specialized training, because the athlete still has a lot of trainability, or they have high trainability. Um, they've learned, a lot of the basic movements are more specialized movements. Like you've created a position by which you can take advantage of having them at the right point in maturation, and the most sensitive to the training that will kind of happen over the next, like, as you mentioned, like, 7 to 10 years,
yeah.
within the sport itself.
Yeah, it's and here's the thing. It'll be interesting to see. I'm really interested in following what you guys do, because it'll be interesting to see what you come up with
Mm,
in terms of a pathway,
right.
and then seeing how easily you're going to be able to stick to it, right?
Right.
Because that's
Right.
always the thing. It's seriously, it
Right.
is. I mean, all the you know what's the classic saying? The best, the most well laid, the best intentions plans, or the most well intentioned plans, or whatever that saying is, right? It never goes the way you want it to go.
Right.
And I mean, I stopped writing long term plans for athletes, individual athletes, a long bloody time ago, because I just found that it was just too hard to, like, it's good to do it as an exercise in terms of what you want ideally to happen at certain stages, because you need to
Mm,
understand that. And by writing it out, and I tell coaches this all the time, whether it's a multi-year progression or whether it's an annual plan, you got to do it. You got to do it, because for me anyways, putting it all on paper is how I mentally sort of strategize it, and I play with it in my head, and that's how I come to really
mm,
understand it, and then I implement it. But the reality is the more, when you write these things out, you can never stick to them. There's too many variables, there's too many hurdles that come your way, hiccups that that come your way here, because, well, everywhere really, but particularly here, because you have all of this, all these variables that come in that you can't control, right? And so you can write these plans, and I do write everything down. I write workouts, but I keep it very, very simple. And in fact, the Bondarchuk system is actually really good for this, because I write one or two workouts, and we just roll them over with the
mm,
athletes, and we just I don't even worry about planning precise training days, especially this time of year, because we're just going into meets. I just have these two workouts, and I play it by ear, and I always alternate them. If there's two, with some it's only one workout. We just keep repeating it. So I've structured it so it can be done that way. But in reality, some of these athletes I'm only going to see 2 or 3 times a week at most. Um, and so I have to be able to adapt and change things on the fly. Not so much change, but adapt the loads based upon you know, when they're coming out, where we're going to be, right? Because, you know, I'm not always in the same location. So, and I'm just dealing with that right now. I just had a talk with Dizzy, which is the female I was talking about. I had a talk with her last night about how we're going to manage her training now that her school team has started up. Because here's another reality: she, you know, like her head coach at her school is super adaptable. I mean, this guy is like he'll you know he's very very good at, you know, she can do whatever, almost whatever she wants, but she wants to train with her team. Okay.
Right.
She wants to train with her teammates. She wants that. And she should do that. It's good for her. Okay. As a senior, she wants to be a leader. She wants to set a good example. She wants to be part of that. Obviously, this guy, his name's Dan Daly. Obviously, he's created something that she wants to be a part of, right? Well, I'm not, you know, well, we've been training, you know, in small groups for the last 6 months since we started training in September. You know, obviously now that we throw outdoors as one circle, and now we're going to go from 2 athletes throwing to maybe 8 to 10. Well, that's going to change things. So I have to adapt to that, right? So I'm gonna, but it's not easy. You know, it's just, you know, these are the things that get. So so the point is that if I had a plan that said, oh yeah, well, we're going to have to do, you know, X many throws, and in order to get these in, you can't train with your team because you're going to be throwing until 8 o'clock at night if we try to do that,
Right.
because you won't get in the circle enough. Well, it's not going to work, right? I'm not taking that away from her. Why would I do that?
Yeah, and I think this has been an incredible podcast, and one that I kind of planned. I know we both really like to chat training and in chat, just in general. So I kind of anticipated this
One of my flaws, one of my character defects.
Well, I think from my perspective, it's definitely a positive, and it's something I really appreciate and enjoy whenever I listen to one of your podcasts, or a podcast that you're on. So I'll be sure to try and organize, you know, a chat with Mike Catone, get him on the podcast, and bring you on, and, as well as Dr. Hornsby, because I think that'd be a really
Yeah.
interesting chat as well. So we'll kind of plan that for, you know, future shows in the coming weeks and months. As far as, you know, everything we've covered, a lot of what my questions were centered around is just like this very preliminary understanding of, you know, the performance coaching, but also, you know, being driven partly by the sport parent coach that you have on your website, and the podcasts and videos and other podcasts you've been on. So if people are interested in learning more kind of about this model we've been talking about, or this process we've been talking about and referencing a lot, where could we direct them to check it out?
Well, my site is eviltracksport.com, and that's EVELTRAK sport.com. There's no C in track. It was one of the big mistakes I made when I when I first chose my email handle 20 years ago or 25 years ago. When you could only have 8 characters. If I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, but anyways, so that's mine, and I have you know, like the course net there. I mean, I would look at the LTAD network and the work that Mike Young and those guys have done, and James Baker, and they've done really good work. You know, there's, I mean, yeah, you know, we should also, I guess, you know, the term LTAD means something very specific, and I'm not sure how many people will get this deep into this podcast. Hopefully, lots, but you know, yeah, it's a little. It's probably something we should have talked at the beginning. But the term LTAD does mean something very specific, right?
Sure.
Centered around peak height velocity, and
Mm.
you know, like I think I laid out pretty clear here, is that, you know, it's that there are realities that make that such formalized approaches difficult in the high school system. Not impossible, but difficult. So that's a reality. And but anyways, but all that information is good. It doesn't, you know, you read it doesn't mean you have to do it. it doesn't mean you gotta, give up everything you're doing, but let it sink in, and talk to people about it, and see where you have areas in your programming and your development, where in your structure of your training, where you can improve based on some of the advice that these guys have. I mean, anything Mike Young or James Baker puts out, I have a lot of time for. And Mike has a few things on my site as well, but not. I think some of it is LTAD related, but there's other areas where there's way more information that he's put out. It's very good. So just Google that, Mike Young LTAD, and you'll find it.
I love that I gave you an opportunity to plug every product you have and sell yourself, and then you get Mike Young and James Baker and start pushing their stuff. I respect the shit out of that.
That's why I'm broke. And
yeah.
anything I sell on my site, half of it goes to Mike. Like I have his stuff. Anyways, anybody that you see on my site that's not just me, I share the profits 50-50 in perpetuity with them. So
that's awesome. Yeah, and I'll try to get Mike Young on the podcast as well. I don't know how difficult that will be, but I think it'd be a fun chat to kind of keep making these connections.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. And then Derek, do you have any other places you want to direct people? Like, I don't know if you have like social media or a newsletter or anything
Track.
like that.
I mean, I'm at Evil Track on all the various things. I don't put out a lot of social media stuff. The only time I ever even use social media is when I'm either bragging about my kids, or I'm advertising something on my site. But I haven't been super active on my site lately, so but it's all still there. And I have I have the just Evil Track, EVELTRAK. That's the easiest way to find me anywhere. So
I notice you're either bragging about your track, or sorry, your kids, or you're bragging about the facilities.
Yes. My facilities that I'm still searching for a home for. Yeah. My container. So if you want to see something, if you're an S&C guy, if you want something that's really going to blow your mind, go on Instagram and find my post. It's not that far back, with my outdoor container, my side opening door shipping container that I turned into an outdoor weight room. It's pretty incredible. That's awesome. Now has a bullet hole in it.
Really?
Yeah, it's in this place where we train is in a really rough neighborhood, and somebody shot it one night.
Wow. Yeah, those are awesome.
Another story.
Yeah.
Story for another time.
Yeah, and if people want to keep up with what I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram at Josh_Phil WL. You can go to philosophicalweightlifting.com, and you can also just find that anywhere else. Thanks again for listening to the podcast, and we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.
Thanks for listening.